Thank you all for being here, and thanks especially to my friend Professor Brunstetter and some of the friendly faces that I see in the crowd, Professor Zonef and Lynch, and thanks to John especially for keeping me company as we were waiting for the room to clear out and then be able to reoccupy. So today I'm going to talk about torture and insecurity in the 21st century. This is related to a few different projects or mini projects that I have going on. I have a chapter on torture that specifically focuses on one of the topics that we're going to cover today, which is the rise in the popularity of torture with the U.S. public. But then I've also looked at the way in which the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, has become sort of its own self-unit, is narrating its own self, has its own sense of ontological security, and has its own narrative of what it does and what it's good for. And so I'm looking at that as well, and then I'm also interested in sort of expanding the existing research right now in terms of public opinion on torture. So I have a colleague at the University of Utah that I'm joining up with, and we're looking at expanding, having a sort of mega survey on public opinion and torture, international survey. So all we got to do is just get some money to do that, and we're going to do that. That easy, huh? Okay. So here's my email. Feel free to email me any questions that don't come up today or that you don't feel were properly answered today at any time. I like talking about this topic and approaching it, even though it's not a very uplifting topic at all. So looking at the three issues that I hope to cover tonight. Why is torture becoming more popular in the United States? I have a few sort of suggestions on that, even though there's no clear answer to that. How is this related to broader transnational trends in contemporary global politics, if at all? Are we in an era where we have a sort of overwhelming sense of anxiety and insecurity understood in a different way that we typically normally understand it in international relations? And then, if torture is becoming more popular, at least in the United States, if not more broadly, what forms of contestation, what narratives might we practice to challenge the narrative of and belief in torture's efficacy? Because a lot of the support for torture rests on the notion that it serves a function that historically, for thousands of years, it's never served, and that is to get accurate information, and not only accurate information, but the most accurate information in the quickest amount of time. That is almost intuitive now, and how do we provide sort of a counterintuitive sense or set of stories to contest that? And that's where I'll conclude tonight. So why is this important? Up through the 1990s, generally, even though we still see the practice of torture throughout the 1990s and through the 2000s, up through the 1990s, there was at least a consensus at a particular level in international relations against torture. But then it reemerged not only as a practice, but as a practice that was justified, including within democracies in the 2000s, especially after September 11th. But it's being reinforced and becoming more popular the further you get from September 11th. In fact, torture wasn't that popular in the United States right after September 11th. So if you look at it, it's not about an objective threat. Those of you that know a little bit about constructivism, this is one of the many reasons why I can sometimes self-identify as a constructivist. There are certain social constructions and stories that are made about torture, and they are not always linked to an objective sort of stimulus or threat in the recent past as a reason for why it is popular. The more it's debated in the open environment of democracies, more generally, and the more information that emerges that debunks the logic of torture. We have more information now than we've ever had before about the torture that emerged in the 2000s practiced by the United States, that it does not work to produce accurate information. But the more that information has emerged, yet counterintuitively, the more popular it is becoming. Torture has never been more popular than it is today, at least in the United States. So that's a puzzle. And it's also occurring in a liberal democracy in the United States, which spearheaded the anti-torture norm or convention, or in conjunction with other actors and entrepreneurs in international relations. Finally, 21st century dynamics. Is there something about the 21st century and the speed and the pace of the 21st century, and the sense of anxiety that's attached to that could have something to say about this, a background condition that could be linked to this. And then there's something about images that we see, that we're constantly seeing more quickly than ever before, that's providing at least a background, permissive environment that leads to an anxiety that could maybe lead to the need for control, and torture could be one way in which we could exercise or support the control over an environment that is otherwise seemingly out of control. So historically, the functions of torture, why use it? First, historically, the three functions of torture, the first one historically was a way for the sovereign power to demonstrate its authority, the way to punish individuals within a particular society and to show that there is control over that individual. And so some of you, if you've ever read Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, he starts off, if you haven't yet, read the first 15 pages if you're into this kind of stuff. And he starts off showing how there is a drawing and quartering and a public spectacle of a torture, one of the last ones in French society in the late 18th century or early 19th century. And sovereign authorities used to punish in the open and not in public. And so until the early 18th century, 19th century, torture was done in public to demonstrate the power of the sovereign. But then at a certain point, for Foucault and others, the sovereign no longer had to do it. It went from punishment to discipline. Sovereigns didn't need to do that because people would discipline themselves, and so there was no need to demonstrate that authority publicly. And so if that's the case, then torture lost its function when it came to demonstrating authority because it was no longer either necessary or as effective. Secondly, torture's been used to get confessions, to get people to say something that you want them to say, whether it was true or not. So we see this in the Inquisitions, in some of the witch trials that the United States has had over the centuries, or at least before the United States that we saw in Salem. It was a way to get people to admit to something or to change their mind about something publicly, and to use that for political purposes. Related to that, torture has been good to terrorize populations. Particular regimes use torture to be able to terrorize or pacify potential resistance. So authoritarian regimes use it to neutralize dissent. You see this in some Latin American contexts. You definitely see it in some of the reactions to the Arab Spring in the Middle East. And we have one example. I have one example of an individual that was tortured in Syria shortly after the beginning of that civil war in 2011. Finally, it has been known to get accurate information, but historically this has never been a function of torture. It has, however, served as the key justification for it, especially in the U.S. after 9/11. So I wouldn't argue that this is a function of torture, but it is a reason for torture that is used to politically justify torture, at least in the United States, since September 11. And even more so in the last few years, out openly in the United States when it enters into discussions and discourses that you see in the media. Now, I will deal with what we call it when you talk about this, because there is a little bit of Orwellian language that's been attached to what would otherwise be known as torture in the form of enhanced interrogation techniques. But if you look at the surveys ask individuals their opinion on torture, not on enhanced interrogation techniques. So this is not as relevant to the semantic issue. That itself is an interesting side research issue of you're tough enough to torture, you think torture works, but you're not tough enough to call it torture, you call it enhanced interrogation techniques. So we can talk about that as well during the Q&A if you'd like. So torture's popularity in the US. If you look at the surveys through time, and this is actually a big side debate for those that focus on torture and also public opinion in the United States. If you look at the Pew survey, which is sort of a consistent survey through time, up through 2009, a lot of the options that you're provided in terms of the question of is torture to gain important information from suspected terrorists, can it be justified? So already that's a loaded question, because then that assumes that the torturer is intended to be able to get information from important information, right, from suspected suspects. So it's a little bit of a loaded question. But if you look at the category of often and sometimes, you didn't have a majority that said often or sometimes it could be justified until the late 2000s. And then in 2009, it switches. And ever since then, you've had a majority in the United States answering either often or sometimes it can be justified. And that's a recent development. And that's only been reinforced by different surveys through time. And it's a little bit of apples to oranges because you have to look at other surveys and other surveying agencies, public opinion agencies, to be able to look at this. Nevertheless, I actually think that that conceals torture's popularity, at least when it's asked in the United States. Now, it's not just that a majority of respondents answer often or sometimes, because I think you need to be careful in the way in which we collapse those categories. You need to add the third category, which is rarely. So if you look at the Pew survey, often or sometimes in 2004, it's 43, but if you add the folks that say rarely, it's always been a majority that have been in favor of torture. Now, why would I suggest that we should do that? Well, maybe if we're thinking of those folks that would say it rarely could be justified, those are the individuals that would assume that there got to be really exceptional circumstances to justify torture. And the powers that be should only torture in those really unique circumstances. Well, if you say rarely, and that is honestly sanctioning the authorities to be able to do it anytime, so long as they evoke a justification for the practice of torture that is hidden from all of us, and we have no evidence to the contrary. So I think that we can at least make a case that you should collapse, often, sometimes, or rarely, into that category to get a proper assessment of torture. The United States signed by Ronald Reagan, a hippie, right? In 1988, signed the Convention Against Torture, became U.S. law. This is what we don't think of when we think about conventions, is that when they become ratified in the Senate, as it was in 1994 in the United States, that became U.S. law. It did not provide any exceptions in terms of rarely. So even when the United States is torturing in rare occasions or for rare circumstances, it's still breaking U.S. law. And that might be one of the reasons, on the side note, for why you call it enhanced interrogation techniques rather than torture. Ever since then, since Pew kind of stopped issuing this survey on a regular basis, you see other surveys collapsing these categories of often and often, sometimes rarely, reinforcing this notion that it's becoming more popular in the United States. In the AP survey, 60 often or sometimes can be justified, 74 often, sometimes rarely. A different survey, the Zigart YouGov survey of September 2012, didn't find as popular of responses to this, but what it did do was assess also particular techniques. And Amy Zegart, the PI on the survey, said that if you look at it that way, while collectively it might not be as popular, it turns out that Americans don't just like the general idea of torture more now versus 2005 when apparently the survey was also issued. They like specific torture techniques more too. And so she actually tested some of the techniques and asked how popular they were. And the numbers actually went up for particular techniques. So, December 2014, your senator, Senator Feinstein, the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee, went on the Senate floor and released the torture report, right? The report on the CIA's activities during the 2000s in terms of its intelligence program. The report had several conclusions that debunked the notion that torture provides accurate information. It concluded a bunch of different conclusions. I think it had 20 sort of summary statements at the beginning that Senator Feinstein sort of mentioned. One was that no information from the CIA's torture program led to saved lives. Torture did not provide information that led to bin Laden's location, as we were told by the CIA and as is demonstrated clearly in the movie Zero Dark 30. This is in several different conclusions 1, 2, and 16. And it also led to false leads and wasted resources, and it actually delayed the discovery of bin Laden's location. The courier, the famous courier, that led to bin Laden's location in Abbottabad. The CIA and the U.S. intelligence agencies knew his name in 2002. 2002. It took them until 2010 to find the Abbottabad location. In these documents, at least, that the CIA provides the Senate, this is using CIA documents, it delayed the discovery of that location, not led to it, as we're told in Zero Dark 30. And yet, nevertheless, there's a Washington Post poll that comes out a few weeks thereafter, and torture's popular still, even more popular. Often or sometimes can be justified, 58%, often, sometimes, rarely, 77% support, even after the release of this report. So, how are we to understand this, at least in the US context? What are some of the mechanisms that we could look to that maybe are developing the support for torture? I think there are some macro-political things that are going on. I'll talk about one of them in a second in terms of a global sort of sense of anxiety that we might have. But here are some mechanisms that we might look to on a micro-political basis, some of the stories that we might have, or some of the reasons why people believe in the efficacy of torture. Narrative extrapolation, the what-if counterfactual. Those of you that take classes on international ethics, maybe those of you that teach classes on international ethics, we are provided this what-if question all the time, right? What if and then when we find out that you have kids, it was sort of really personal, right? What if your kid had been kidnapped? And the person that you had in captivity knew where your child was, otherwise they were going to die. What would you do, right? And the what-if counterfactual, a situation I will never face, okay? I will never face that situation. But it is substituted as if it is factual. And this is the what-if counterfactual that we were provided over and over and over again. And you can tailor it to whomever you're asking that to. Elites use that. The media uses that. Citizens use that. I get this all the time when I go, on the rare occasions I still go to family reunions, and they find out, they make the mistake to ask me what it is I do for a living, and I say, well, I was studying torture. And they say, well, I can see why you torture. Couldn't you? You get that, okay, on a micro-political level. Even just war philosophers, professors even will throw that out there every once in a while. It's not just the masses, okay? There could be an elite sort of rarefied era of the academy where you can come up with situations where torture could be justified. If terrorist use of a weapon of mass destruction were correctly known to be imminent, if there was good reason to suppose that this captured enemy did in fact know its whereabouts, if the desire to save innocents from mass destruction were one's governing motive, if sadistic hatred of the enemy was entirely lacking, if the coercive methods applied were known to be effective in eliciting truth, and if only such coercion as was necessary were applied, the proportionate torture would be just. This is a philosophy professor at Oxford, a professor of moral and pastoral theology. That's 6 ifs. That's no longer a counterfactual, that's a hallucination, in my view. But we can imagine it. We can imagine getting into that situation, or at least Professor Bigard can imagine getting into that situation. And if you talk to him, he'll say that this happened. Okay? He'll say that the people he talks to says that this happens. So in that rarefied era, at least in Oxford, I'm a Midwestern hayseed, so I can't think this philosophically. But you can come up with situations that are counterfactually at least persuasive enough for our imaginations to jump in there and think it's plausible. And if all of these conditions, 6 of them, are met, torture would be just. So, leading to other mechanisms of support. But that narrative extrapolation is one that is a key one that sort of links some of these other mechanisms. We also have what I would say is just what the classical realist Reinhold Niebuhr, those of you that have read some of his work, especially Immoral Man, Immoral Society, has talked about as just something that is sort of intrinsic to humans. That we have all of these selfish, really anarchical sort of drives, but we can't ever admit to those. So we have to come up with a moral story to justify our otherwise immoral behavior. Now Niebuhr says this is more likely at the level of groups than it is even at individuals, but sometimes individuals do that as well. So we use moral language to justify those basic drives. And in this case, to justify our otherwise anarchic lusts. And so for Niebuhr, if we're applying that today, the ticking time bomb is the moral argument for the otherwise basic drive, or perhaps motive that's being served in torturing. And maybe not even motive, but intent, because we always hear, well, if they're intending to save lives, well, how do I know that? How do I know the difference between an intent to save lives and a sadistic sort of lust to just torture the hell out of somebody? I don't know it, right? But that's the moral argument that you provide for the self-interest or the self sort of drive to exact revenge on someone. And revenge is something we've all experienced, I'm sure, at an interpersonal level. Hopefully it never rises to the level of wanting to torture somebody to get revenge. But that is one expression of revenge, is torturing. That also has to be coupled with a trust or faith in authority and the malleability of intent. The flexibility or fluidity of intent. Because intent is interior. It is a mental process, and it can only be expressed, perhaps, through language. We can change what our intent was in terms of what we were doing after the fact. And it's the story that someone tells us that we have to trust in order to believe that torture is useful. So it's not just the fact that moral language is used, but that story has to be compelling to the people who are receiving it. And the person that is telling you it, you at least have to trust them. And so a lot of the most sort of vibrant, common defenses that I've had or I've been subject to for torture is, well, I don't know if it works, but I talked to somebody that said it worked. They were whatever, right? They know somebody in the CIA or whatever. Well, I mean, I'm kind of an academic, so I'm skeptical of everything, right? And that's why a lot of us aren't very fun to be around most of the time. But we're cynical and skeptical most of the time about whatever anybody is saying, even including our friends, right? So we're not always going to trust a story, but some people do. And so this might explain, when you look at the subgroups that are most supportive of torture, it is ironically the people who are, anyone know, most religious. Evangelical Christians, what they break down as non-Hispanic Catholics in some of these surveys. The ones that go to church more, they're the ones that actually support torture more. Now the irony, of course, is that Jesus himself was tortured, right? And then there are all these biblical themes about the issue of the flesh and and whatever else that would be, you would think, against torture. But there it's not about torture so much as the faith in the things that we cannot see, a belief in something that we cannot see, that you're willing to believe in, and how intent can be changed. So that for so long during the 2000s, we're given the ticking time bomb scenario, and then after bin Laden is killed, the argument is, well, it wasn't about ticking time bomb scenarios, it was about torturing somebody that maybe 6 years later will break down and say, "Ah," or whatever. And therefore, that was what the intent was of torture. You can switch that because intent is malleable because it's internal. And it's only expressed through through stories, and we have to have a trust or faith in the authority that is issuing that. Fourth, the image or the imagining of torture. One of the lessons we get from Foucault is that punishment goes into hidden areas. We don't see it. And so one of the aspects of modern torture, or postmodern torture, if you will, is that we don't actually see it happening. And so we don't know what it looks like. And so we have to have stand-ins to be able to tell us, show us, and allow us to imagine what the torturing is like. And in the 2000s, we had a lot of stand-ins for that. And it didn't, on those rare occasions where we do get images of torture, it didn't look like Lindy England and Charles Grainer torturing somebody and pointing to a bunch of Iraqis that are naked. It looked like Kiefer Sutherland doing the torturing, right? And so if torture is hidden, we don't have an image of what it looks like, but then we can imagine, if we are predisposed to being sort of supportive of it, we can imagine that the torture is either not that bad, or the person torturing is good, or the person getting tortured is really bad. And so we have stand-ins for that allow us to imagine what that could be. You even have members of the Bush administration, intelligence officials, looking as one of their models for torturing to the show 24. You have a Supreme Court Justice, Scalia, that actually says, well, look what just happened on 24. There's an example where they're taking time bomb. I mean, that, using that as the model. And the point here is that images can break through that, but if we don't have images for that, our imagination can really run wild. And it can feel to us to be more truthful than the truth itself. This is something I talked about in my second book about the imaginative strata of power. One of the things that allows power to operate, power writ large, is that we can imagine things that are ambiguous or invisible to us in ways, and internalize them individually in ways that allow for those things to happen because we don't have any images of them. A contextual factor, those are some of the narratives or sort of factors that could be explaining on an individual level, but if we look globally at some of these contextual factors, I think adding to the different deployments of this concept of interdependence that we have, which I'll talk about a couple of them in a second, we also are in an era of sort of image interdependence and an era of insecurity, but a different kind of insecurity than we would have if we're just thinking about our physical sort of survival. And so, of course, what do we have here? Anyone? Who or what is this? ISIS, right? And we forget that one of the first sort of manifestations of ISIS is in 2004 with Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, and here he is getting ready to behead Nick Berg, who was, I believe, a contractor, in 2004, shortly after Abu Ghraib photos had been exposed. And then, of course, the different, more recent cases with higher productive capacities, by the way. ISIS is really about productive capacities, production capacities, right? Having these very clear videos that are sort of high in production value. And so you have all of these other cases, especially these two, where ISIS is going to great lengths to make a representation of what this is. And then, of course, the slaughter of the Iraqi soldiers in Tikrit about a year ago or so. The context, then, the context and the dissemination of images. Some of you might know a little bit about interdependence. Complex interdependence, which is a concept or a process or a set of processes developed 30 years ago now, over 30 years ago in an article before it became a book, by Professors Robert Cohen and Joseph Nye. Complex interdependence, their only point was that our notions of power change when we're in a world that is sort of complexly, in a complex interdependent world. Our notion of power changes. Because then it's not just about your ability to get others what they would not do, otherwise would not do. But if we're interdependent, you're not dependent on me and I'm not necessarily dependent on you, but we're both dependent on one another, or we're dependent or exposed to broader global processes like globalization, then power is about how sensitive we are to that interdependent linkage and how vulnerable we are as well. So others in the 2000s have taken this concept and sort of updated it and said we're not just interdependent in terms of globalization processes, but one process that we're interdependent with is violence. And so Professor Daniel Dubney, who's at Johns Hopkins now, wrote a book called Bounding Power. Even there you can see how there's a sense of interdependence in the title of the book. And he talked in that about violence interdependence. Related to that then, we can think about the 21st century as a time of image interdependence. But something else in the 21st century in terms of a contextual or transnational factor, that there is a sense that we need to do things more quickly than we ever have before, or we might be missing out on something. A sense that technology can assist us in doing that, but it can also leave us behind. And that the images that we see are the stand-ins for reality, and we're exposed to those in ways that give us a sense that the world itself is spinning out of control. Now, the interesting thing about this with the 21st century is that there are those like Steven Pinker and others who are saying we're actually in a time that's the most peaceful time in all of human history right now. But people don't feel that way, especially when you go back right to the previous slide. People don't feel that way. So what is image interdependence? It's representations of violence, increased and instantaneous exposure to it. It makes us more sensitive and vulnerable to the insecurity associated with the image, but in a different way. Sensitive in the sense that we're exposed to it. And even if you're not on the internet and you don't get the next video that ISIS has uploaded or that they've uploaded that somebody else re-uploads to YouTube, it's on CNN or it's on these other cable entertainment, they're not news networks, they're cable entertainment networks. And it's on there right in front of you, or it's in the paper, or it's in the student paper, or somebody tells you about it and you load it up on your phone. We are sensitive to that and exposed to that more quickly and in ways that we've never been before, and we're also more vulnerable to that. Vulnerability implies not just that you're sensitive and exposed to it, but that you can adapt as a result. The adaptation is not happening either. How do you adapt to an image of someone being beheaded in front of you? Of 100 people on a beach being beheaded in front of you? How do you adapt to that? Adjust to it so you don't feel insecure. I haven't been able to do that yet, other than just not looking, but sometimes it's hard not to look. So it's also the speed at which these transformations are happening. So some scholars have looked at just the speed of international politics and whether we're in an era of late modernity or post-modernity. There's this notion of speed sort of giving us this sense that things are out of control. Simon Glazos has written a couple of books on this. The pace and speed of life makes us anxious. It makes us feel like things are not within our control. And this is something maybe that's been happening for centuries, but is at a point now where attached to the image we're insecure. There's a sense that existing institutions, more importantly, like law or democracy, are obsolete with the fast and rapid threats. And when you think of ISIS, it's not just the fact that they can upload a video seconds after they've beheaded somebody. It's the other sense of faster, rapidly approaching threats. Think about how quickly ISIS was able to sweep across not just Syria, but parts of Iraq. And this sense that they're transnational now when they're in parts of Libya or Egypt, or Boko Haram says that they're sort of an affiliate of ISIS. That sense of speed. It's not just the materiality of the threat, it's the speed of the threat that makes us anxious. and that our existing institutions that we've had for centuries or decades or even a year or whatever, that's not going to be enough to be able to check it. Political communities can be manipulated then over this anxiety related to speed. And then the sort of short answer to this is that as it relates to torture, torture is at least one way you can reassert some control over something, regardless of whether you're getting any information from it or not. That you might just support torture as an end itself. Going back to the old George Orwell line that the point of torture is always torture. In this case, the point of torture is its ability to control that which we cannot control. And technology then distributes these images, and it can also collate the reactions of people to this. So, how can we contest torture? Are there any ways that we can at least contest the torture stories that we hear around us quite frequently? I'm pretty skeptical that we can. I don't think you can put the genie back in the bottle, and at least in the United States, I don't think its popularity will ever wane. I don't think it will. I think it will always stay at that level, above 50% of often and sometimes, and in the 70s when it comes to often, sometimes, or rarely being justified. That's just my sense, okay? That's not very optimistic. But why is that important? It's important because if you think of not just the public opinion, but the way in which politicians, representatives respond to that, it is in their interest to support torture because it will be one more thing that will ensure that they get elected. If they don't torture, maybe that will be one thing that their opponents can use to make them seem weak or whatever. But I think there are 4 what I would call micro-political tactics on the level of telling stories. And so some of the mechanisms of support that allow for or facilitate torture as being appropriate or necessary, you can contest those as well with other stories that are actually more sort of straightforward than we might realize. One could be what I would call intuition. Now, I'm not here to talk about where intuition comes from. That's for people like some of these down here that read Immanuel Kant and Arendt and other philosophers and Aristotle and everything else. I might read them as well, but I don't understand them that well. So I'm not going to tell you where intuition comes from. But we kind of, every once in a while, and in movies, had this, where intuition would pop in and we'd have a sense that torture actually produces the not truth. Anyone ever seen this movie? Which one is it? Takes place here in Southern, not here.
Reservoir Dogs.
Reservoir Dogs, right? Okay. I mean, my generation, this is what we watched instead of Saturday cartoons, is Tarantino movies. What is the scene here? Holly, do you want to explain the scene to everyone?
No.
It's not a very uplifting scene. Well, they're out. They're a group of criminals. They don't even know each other's names because they have to, they have color-coded names or whatever. So one's Mr. Orange, one's Mr. Black. Anyway, they're all in a heist together. And they go to the bank, and somebody hits the bank sort of alarm and tips off the police. And so there's a sense to them, right, when they all sort of reconvene thereafter and a couple people get shot and whatever else, that the police were tipped off that early. There had to be a rat amongst them. And so they actually kidnap one of the police officers that's there on the scene. They put him in the back of an old 70s car or whatever. And then they bring him into this rendezvous point. And a few of them, before their leader gets there, a few of them start to beat him to see if the cop knows who the rat is that's amongst them. And so one of their leaders, this guy right here, nice guy Eddie, Sean Penn's brother, he's actually dead, I think. He died a few years ago. But nice guy Eddie comes in, he says, "What are you guys doing?" And they say, "Well, we're beating him to find out if he knows who actually tipped off the cops so that they would break up this heist." And he says, well, and it's a Tarantino movie, and I live in Utah now, so I have to edit it for family content. If you beat this guy long enough, he'll tell you he started the Chicago fire. Now that don't necessarily make it so. We used to have this as intuition, that if you beat somebody long enough, they're going to give you information, but the information might be bunk. It might be completely worthless. And so you used to have this intuition, and this is related to what I would call the sort of ancient empiric that we've had for centuries and even millennia in human history. It started out in, its expression nowadays is in our Fifth Amendment. Those of you studying law, what's the Fifth Amendment? Well, how does it relate to torture? In the United States, what's the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution? Anyone know? No self-incrimination, right? You don't have to, you can take the Fifth, you can get on the stand, you don't even have to say anything. Okay? But if you look at scholars who have looked at the history of the Fifth Amendment, It isn't that you have the Fifth Amendment in the Constitution just because you want to have some touchy-feely rights that you're giving everybody that you might try. It's that historically, going back to Talmudic law, English common law, Dutch-run courts in the United States, colonial courts, that there was a sense that if people were tortured, and people were tortured for centuries, but if that people were tortured, the information that they give you was not reliable. And that was just intuitive. And so this is something that had been around for thousands of years that contrasts the notion that torture gives you the truth. Torture is good to get people to say what they think you want to hear, not necessarily the truth. So we've had, for a long time, going up to the present day in the U.S. Fifth Amendment, this sense, this ancient empiric that's been around for thousands of years, that torture or coercion or whatever, right, whatever we want to call it, doesn't necessarily lead you to the truth. And so it's not just about reading somebody their rights, it's that you want good information to be able to convict them. Otherwise you can't. So this provides us a different wager for torture idealists, as I would call them, the people that support torture. They're idealists. They're idealists. They're we-are-the-world idealists. And the wager is, if you think that torture produces really accurate information, and not just really accurate information, but the quickest amount of information that you could possibly get, then just get rid of the Fifth Amendment in this country. You don't need nearly as many lawyers. You'll get convictions right away. Why would we stop with foreign suspects? Why not do it to everybody? I mean, if they know something and they're guilty, just torture the heck out of them, right? And get the proper, accurate information right away. You wouldn't need any sort of, side hearings. You wouldn't need to post bail. You wouldn't need to do any of that. You could convict people right away. They wouldn't accept the wager because it's absurd on its face. But then you have to suspend that same intuition or logic if you believe some of the heroic sort of idealistic stories that we see a few slides ago. So a different counterfactual then that we can pose to somebody, and this is what I do to students that give me the question, what would you do if your child was ever kidnapped and blah, 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 is what would you do if, but cross out your child was missing or in danger, you were being tortured. What would you do? You'd say anything, right? You'd say the truth first, okay? And what if you're being waterboarded, you say the truth first? What if they waterboarded you 82 more times, like the United States CIA did with some of the suspects? What are you going to say then? You'll say anything, because you want the torture to end. That's the ancient empiric, and that's the intuitive basis that we used to have, and that you could articulate on an even micro-political level, or just a casual level. Second, aesthetics and discourse, the two related. If torture being hidden and the images of torture being hidden from us is what makes it so powerful and allows our imaginations to run wild, then you flip that, and every time that you see a picture of what torture really looks like, or at least a representation of what it did look like in certain context, that could contest it. And we have seen evidence of this, of either images changing our perception of what torture is, in the form of the Abu Ghraib photographs in the spring of 2004 when those broke, on both 60 Minutes 2, and Seymour Hersh, I guess, was one of the individuals that broke the story. So you do have Abu Ghraib in 2004, but then we also have evidence of those in power, when there are images that are out there, or not out there yet, but they have them, of destroying those images. So in 2005, there were a bunch of waterboarding sessions that had been recorded by the CIA, and one CIA agent went out and destroyed them. They know what those sessions, if they get loaded up to YouTube or WikiLeaks or whoever it is, disseminates it, there's something in there that leads to a sort of insecurity of the torturer over those being tortured. So we know that there's something about the images, maybe not necessarily this, but something about the images that makes them vulnerable. And then we also can couple that, because images can be manipulated. And sometimes when images are disseminated, right, then the focus, like it is with WikiLeaks, when it comes to some of the documents, the focus doesn't get on the images, it gets on who released the images and why, and so it becomes a distraction. So you couple this with testimonials of people who actually have been tortured. The New York Times ran a story a few years ago of some of the Iraqi victims of torture, and describing what it was like. And in that case, they're actually underselling what it's like to be tortured. What happened, this Iraqi victim says in one of the New York Times articles, what happened is not like what I just said. What happened was much worse. But those are stories that sort of counteract this narrative. There's also the related notion that the body has its own form of resistance, that the mark of torture leaves something that is, Dan was talking about it, that is its own form of accountability that challenges some of these narratives. And we have evidence that the body and its resistance is something that insecuritizes those that are torturing as well. So in this case, it's that those in power, when they leave marks of torture on the body, they are vulnerable in ways that they wouldn't otherwise be. This is why, for Darius Rejali, who's one of the experts on torture, he examined all the cases of torture, or most of the cases of torture, where you could find perhaps a ticking time bomb. He couldn't find it. He couldn't find that scenario in this 700 pages. Dan, are you going to sign this soon? Yeah, and have it read it in the next week. 700 pages, couldn't find a ticking time bomb. But what he did notice was that democracies are really concerned about this. And what they're concerned about is that they don't want to leave marks on people who they torture. So that's why waterboarding is a par excellence, because it doesn't leave any marks on the body itself. We have evidence that even non-democracies are somewhat insecure over this, over the body, and the marks that could be left there. Who is this? Anyone know? Hamza Ali Al-Khateeb. A boy in Syria. There, you would think he's 14 years old. I don't think he'd had his 14th birthday yet. But in the spring of 2011, when the Arab Spring was happening, there were protests in Syria, like many other places across northern Africa and the Middle East. And this boy went out to join a protest because his friends were going out and his family was going out. And the Syrian regime obviously reacted a little bit differently than a lot of the other regimes did to some of these protests. And they not only fired on some of the protesters, but they kidnapped some of the protesters, and this is one of the individuals that got kidnapped. So for a week, his family had no idea what had happened to him. And then the Syrian officials show up, and they bring the dead body of Hamza Ali Al-Khateeb to his family. And they say, we will give you your son's body, but you have to sign a statement that you won't talk about what kind of marks are on him at all, or even publicize it whatsoever. So they did. And then they went back on that agreement when they saw the marks on him, because his genitalia was cut off. He had electroshock marks all over him. And so what they did was they brought in someone with a camera and a medical expert to narrate and go through the body all of the marks that the Syrian regime had left upon him. Now what's important is not just the awfulness, that must be like if you're a family member dealing with that and that corpse of your son with all of these marks on it. That's got to be awful. But what's interesting here, in terms of the resistance, is that the Syrian regime didn't want them to talk about it. And that's not a democracy. And so it's that the body might leave these physical marks, whether the body is still alive or not. The body itself is something that is its own form of resistance and carries its own stories. Now, what did the Syrian regime do in reaction to this? They brought on their own medical expert to go on state-run TV and contest the marks on the body. That's still important, I think, as well. Finally, we might engage in what I would title inverting binaries. What does inverting binaries mean? I think it's actually it's something I come up with because you always got to come up with phrases. But it's something that philosophers, political theorists, we've all done for ages. Hannah Arendt does this in Eichmann in Jerusalem, where she talks about the Nazis going in to Denmark and they're carrying this notion of ruthless toughness. And that ruthless toughness actually melts like butter in the sun in the face of the non-violent resistance of the Danes. And Reinhold Niebuhr talks about this when he talks about irony, that you might feel like you're doing things that are making you more secure, but it's actually making you less secure. And Richard Rorty, another philosopher, talked about irony as well. We invert these binaries. We have binaries that actually can constrain us in international relations and the way in which we analyze things. Something is either masculine or feminine. Something is either tough or weak. Something is secure or insecure. And those binaries are problematic. But what you can do, I think, when it comes to torture, is take the seemingly intuitive binary and invert it. So if you think about security and insecurity, you torture because you want to be secure. But the information that comes from torture makes you more insecure, more and more insecure. And if you have the torture to begin with, you're kind of insecure anyway. So those that torture, instead of seeking out security, are actually making them more insecure. You know who the courier, you know the courier's name in 2002, and anybody that knows the courier, that could lead you to bin Laden, you start questioning them, and the minute you start torturing, you see it all throughout the CIA report, they start mentioning all kinds of other things that distracts the CIA and the intelligence community to other things rather than the courier. It makes you more insecure than you otherwise would not be. Conservative or radical, if you look at the surveys in the United States, those that self-identify as conservative are the most supportive of torture. But this is something actually that gets a plurality of support across different parts of the spectrum. Nevertheless, it's conservative to support torture, and it's radical to want to read someone their rights, right? Well, actually, if you think about it, for over 225 years, at least the stated policy of the United States was not to torture. And you throw that out because of 19 people with box cutters. That's not conservative, that's radical. The conservative looks at traditions, standing the test of time and having their own sense of being right. And so torturing is something that's radical, it's not conservative. Powerful or powerless. Again, this relates to conservative or radical. You're supposed to be more powerful if you're torturing. But if you're throwing away all of this tradition, all of these institutions, all of this faith in what has worked before, others are getting you to do what you otherwise would not do. You're powerless, actually, in the face of the insecurity that leads you to torture. And then finally, this notion that you're tough or courageous or masculine if you torture. You're a tough guy. And it's weak or cowardly, and I put it in quotes because I don't like this, but feminine if you read them their rights. It's feminine to read them their rights and to not torture. It's tough to torture. Now, maybe that's the case, but Henry Shue, another philosopher, has said that, and this is why I don't put torture in the language of just war. We are not in the fog of war when it comes to the torture chamber. That person cannot fight back at all. You are not looking at any of your peripheral vision for a possible ambush attack. That person is completely under your control. There's nothing tough or masculine about it. They can't fight back whatsoever. And so every once in a while you can look at it as being actually very weak, very insecure to be able to torture. And we see this every once in a while open up in testimonies or assessments of people through time. William James, a sort of pragmatic philosopher of the turn of the century, the turn of the other century, 19th century, and some lesser-known lectures, was talking about all these cases of mass hysteria that certain political communities had experienced. And he was looking at those who had written up a set of instructions regarding how to torture people so that you knew they were a witch, okay, in the past, in the history or whatever. And it was actually a document called the Witch's Hammer. Nowadays, these would be the Biden memos that we have, okay? How to actually torture so that you can tell someone is a witch. And he flat out says the powers of life and death these people had, with a mental makeup that is almost idiotic for its meanness, timorousness, and unmanliness. That's William James in 1895. The Truth Commissions in South Africa, some of you might have studied these, some of you might have knowledge of these. What do they do? What do the Truth Commissions do? Anyone know? In the 1990s? Truth and Reconciliation Commission, sometimes they're called. Anyone? Some of these people know. Go ahead. Hallie, you ready to step up?
I'm talking for the people, but essentially they had the victims and the perpetrators both come together and tell their stories.
Exactly.
And in order to get it all out there so that then people could move on.
Added to the process of forgiveness. So if, right, the victims or the victims' families forgave the perpetrator, then they could get amnesty. That was the idea of it. But every once in a while, you see the victims of those in the apartheid regime that did torture use this binary right here. So one of the torturers in the apartheid regime gets up, tells his story of using what he calls the wet bag, but it's really waterboarding, right? And he talks about it in front of a victim of waterboarding, and the victim speaks back. He says, "What kind of man?" And you can see a video of this. What kind of man that uses a method like this one of the wet bag to people or other human beings repeatedly? And listening to those moans and cries and groans. This person can't fight back, right? And taking each of these people very near to their desk. What kind of man are you? And in the video, you see him pointing right at him. What kind of man is that? So this is one of the victims that actually became a politician in post-apartheid South Africa to the apartheid perpetrator at the time. Any of these stories, okay, is not going to be enough to move public opinion or challenge the increasingly reinforced notion that torture works to get proper information. It's not. But it may be the best that you can do in an era where we're in image interdependence and we're very insecure over our inability to control things. Because maybe the most that we can control are the stories that we tell one another, and contesting those stories when they challenge, if not our intuition, the logic that we have at time and space. And that's where I'll stop. Thank you.